Zoom out. Let me invite you to step out of our comfort here in The Hague. I was born in Manila, the Philippines, country of 110 plus million people. As a child, I watched the evening news. It's a country that's a paradise, but it also experienced a lot of natural and human-made disasters. Typhoons, earthquakes, floods, families and rubble, armed conflict in several parts of the archipelago, children and families in shelters and evacuation centers. From the people of the United States of America, those were what was ingrained in boxes. Foreign aid as comfort, foreign aid as promise. As I grew older, another hard lesson hit home. After the 9/11 terror attacks in the United States, the Philippines, amongst many other countries in the global south, became a frontline in the United States-led global war on terror. Many of you perhaps do remember the Coalition of the Willing. Military aid poured in many countries worldwide, including the Philippines, Thailand, Colombia, many countries in the Middle East and South Asia. That means counter-terror operations proliferated. Checkpoints multiplied. Military operations, intelligence operations widened. Extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances also increased, funded by US aid. And too often, people paid with their lives. Unarmed civilians. For nearly 2 decades, I have followed this story, studying, working, and publishing on foreign aid, human rights, great power rivalries, and publishing also so that I can learn so that power meets accountability and dignity is not collateral. For this afternoon, my guiding question is quite simple, but I believe very important. Why are some countries rich enough to give aid while others remain dependent? And this level of power asymmetry persists over long periods of time. I left to understand the systems that make inequality feel inevitable. And today I want to leave with you 3 quintessential points. The first one is why aid exists. Second, the problems that we refuse to name about global development. And third, a path towards better answers. Now, why does aid exist? Aid exists for a lot of reasons. Aid exists because interests of key elites in donor and recipient countries converge. In some cases, for example, donor governments seek stability, a way to actually attract new markets, create new markets for their corporations. And at the same time, it's also a sense of consolidating their leadership in global governance, consolidate their dominant position in several regions of the world. And in many cases, this kind of foreign aid supports lives, education, assistance in humanitarian conflict. And lives are saved when that convergence of interests of donor and recipient governments actually focus on long-term socioeconomic development outcomes, education, health, and other forms of social services. I'll give you an example. In 2023 alone, the United States gave about $62 billion in foreign aid. That's only in 1 year. Picture every resident in The Hague, and there are around 560 plus registered residents in this city. And imagine every resident receiving 100,000 euros. That's a huge amount of money. And for many other projects, these foreign aid were used to actually deliver vaccines, HIV treatment, tuberculosis treatment, malaria control, and many other types of epidemics, local epidemics, and we were able to contain them. And it saved millions of lives, especially the most vulnerable communities. It worked because interests aligned. Washington needed credibility, and donor countries, for example, and bipartisan wins. When other countries are living in a much more stable system, there's no need for building in military weapons. And many governments in the global south needed also dependable financing for their social services. But this is not the full story. Aid fails when the convergence shifts towards the security theater, when it's all about corruption or neglect, and it's all about expanding the military apparatus that will protect only the elite interests of those in the donor and recipient countries. The interests of the marginalized communities in those recipient countries are totally sidelined. There are three problems. Let's start with the first one, military aid tied to war. When interests converge on security first, aid gets trapped to force and civilians pay. Unfortunately, they're called collateral damage, but these are lives of people with dignity like yours. US counterterrorism aid, and in many ways, Europeans are also complicit in this, expanded security forces that were linked to extrajudicial killings of civilians in many places all over the world. This is the same story, not only that we can see this in the Middle East, but also in Thailand and the Philippines, which are defense treaty allies of the United States, but also in Colombia. In Colombia, Planned Colombia's billions of US dollars of foreign aid from the United States turned rural areas into battlegrounds. And this was also responsible for what we now know as falsos positivos scandal, or false positives, where thousands of unarmed civilians were killed and dressed up as if they were rebels for cash rewards funded by US aid. Since 9/11, 4.6 billion people have died in the first 10 first 10 years of the global war on terror, have died in the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan. That is like wiping out the entire population of The Hague, roughly around 560,000 people, more than 8 times over. Even when sold as democracy and human rights promotion, it is very ironic or even antithetical that this is about human rights when it involves the killing of civilians. How do we solve this? I provide some pathways. We need to cut expanded state violence out of aid by banning weapons and ammunition and gear used for violence against civilians. Cut off aid immediately, and require human rights checks into the various institutions in recipient countries that receive foreign aid. We also need to shift dramatically how foreign aid is being used and for what purpose. We should fund long-term socioeconomic development by investing in jobs, schools, health clinics, and other types of social services, as well as local businesses that will stimulate the economic growth in those recipient countries. True dignity is about the future, building an inclusive development for recipient countries. There's also the question about donor exploitation and donor control. When interests converge in distant capitals, in Brussels, in The Hague, or in Washington, D.C., it's all about the corporate interests and elite interests of donor countries, but also in recipient countries. But they rarely reflect or mirror the interests of the most marginalized communities. More often than not, their interests are not even in the planning stage or in the formulation stage of those projects. But that is even worse when we talk about exploitation. In 2003 alone, the United Nations recorded 758 reports of sexual exploitation and abuse in UN peacekeeping missions funded by several donor countries through foreign aid. And these missions are funded by taxpayers' monies. When protectors become predators, the sense of dignity of the people who need aid actually collapses. How do we try to address this? The first one is really giving power back to those communities. Give them real votes and voice when it comes to the planning of those local foreign aid projects. Seldom, they're not even in the discussion at all in Washington, D.C., or even here in The Hague. Provide them several opportunities and safe space to actually report harm and ensure representation from the beneficiary community in the overall management of their aid-funded projects. The second one is also oversight with teeth, right? Use an independent watchdog with a public case tracker. Lead the community when it comes to the veto freeze. If there are reports of abuses, there should be immediate halt in the disbursement of money, and further investigations should actually come on the way. The third problem is also about inequality. The reason why foreign aid exists because there are rich countries who are ready to provide aid and recipient countries who need this money. When interests converge around donor contractors and export profits, aid can lock inequality in place. It can persist over long periods of time. And too much money cycles back to companies and consultants from the donor countries. And to be frank with you, it's just funding the corporate interests in those donor countries. But this also persists, aid persists also because of unfair trade deals between the global north and the global south. Imagine, for example, that Europe is one of the biggest consumers of banana and chocolate and coffee. When was the last time that you actually consumed any of those products in the last 24 hours? Many of those products don't actually grow naturally here. But the unfair trade deals actually make these kinds of inequalities, economic inequalities, persist over time. The solution is to tie aid with high standards for labor. No child labor and slavery when it comes to funding these kinds of projects. Living wages and safe workplaces, as well as clean production for any kind of trade deals that donor countries engage with. There are several problems about foreign aid, but I hope to give you an optimistic picture. Care without consent is control. And when elites align around militarism, counterterrorism, and state security in the protection of the elites, both in donor and recipient countries, foreign aid becomes a smokescreen for those interests. Aid turns into training, battlefield, surveillance, intelligence operations that expand state violence but rarely protect the people's lives, especially in those marginalized communities. The other story is about interest convergence in long-term socioeconomic development. Protect those in the margins of the global socioeconomic hierarchy. Foreign aid could fund jobs, as well as schools, clinics, educational facilities, and better research infrastructure for those countries so that they can innovate further products that will be needed for their own economic growth. In other words, let's realign the convergence. Aid should not only be about the elites who will decide what could be those projects that will be launched in the global south. We should fund what marginalized communities actually choose. In other words, give them the kind of agency that they deserve. Invest where dignity compounds. And that means decent work, high-quality education from primary to research-based education, healthcare, as well as fair courts. And when there are abuses, for example, as in the case of the war on drugs in the Philippines or in Colombia's falsos positivos scandal, We here in the Global North should be ready to prosecute those people and elites responsible for them, not only from the Global North, but also from the Global South. Aid counts when it builds power, power for those marginalized communities. And I hope that aid can also provide them the sense of dignity that they deserve, like you do sitting here listening to these talks. Thank you.